My guest today is Randall Rothenberg. Randall has a long and storied career at the New York Times. He was a science, technology, and politics editor, a media reporter, and daily advertising columnist. He was an advertising columnist for Ad Age for a decade and a writer for Esquire, Wired, and other magazines. His books include Where the Suckers Moon, The Life and Death of an Advertising Campaign, and Histories of Graphic Design and American Politics. He was the Chief Marketing Officer at Booz Allen and remains a consultant at Randall Limited. Most pertinent to this conversation is the fact that he is the former CEO and president and currently a board member of the Interactive Advertising Bureau. Randall is a deep thinker on the dynamics that shape the publishing and advertising and marketing department space. And today we're really going to be getting into where the industry's at. Randall, you and I first met in taxi over 15 years ago at one of the IAB conferences and saw each other a few weeks ago at the IAB annual leadership meeting. It is so good to see you again.
It is wonderful to be here. You know what? I think, though, didn't we first meet at a meeting at Yahoo?
I think but predates that. We were certainly in the meeting in Yahoo, and I remember that, but I remember being in a taxi with you in Florida before that.
Okay. That would be a good place to do it. Sure.
Well, thank you for taking the time, and let's start with putting the current moment in our industry in context. A lot of people love to talk about how unusual this time is because we're seeing large publishers under pressure due to the fragmentation of the media landscape driven by the creator economy. Everybody has a blog. I have a blog or a podcast. And some commentators are saying that this is an unprecedented time. But when you and I spoke a couple of weeks ago, because again, you have the history, you pointed out that it's actually a return to the kind of fragmentation that the media industry saw 100 years ago, where every town had at least one newspaper. And the anomaly was really the later rise of the newspaper consortiums and consolidation around a few television networks. Can you talk more about that evolution?
Yeah. It's kind of the rankest misreading of history, even pure bullshit. To say that this is unprecedented, what we're going through. It's actually a return to historic norms, as you said. And just to put some data on it, and by the way, the data I'm about to cite are from a long piece I wrote several years ago because I got so frustrated by people repeating this kind of bullshit over and over again, especially when it started influencing congressional legislation inaccurately, that I set to correcting the record. But just to put it a little bit of context, as long ago as 1910, so this is 115 years ago, more than one half of all the localities in the United States that had newspapers had competing newspapers. In the 1920s, there were more than 500 American towns and cities, including, by the way, 43% of all cities that had two or more newspapers competing with each other. We had 100 cities in the U.S. In the 1920s had three or more newspapers competing with each other. So now to look at the change, fast forward another 80 years to the year 2000. That's a good year because that's the year that Google first started selling advertising, and it's 4 years before Facebook existed. 2000. Only 1.4% of American cities had competing newspapers. So we'd already gone from nearly half of all cities having competing newspapers to fewer than 2% having competing newspapers even before the internet existed. Consolidation had been happening in the media industry and in the news industry in particular for almost 50 years by the time the internet was invented. There are many culprits, that you can kind of blame for the pre-internet consolidation. I don't necessarily consider them culprits, but number one by far is television. competition from television was without question the biggest, wipeout to the newspaper industry. But the second, almost equally important, was public policy. I'll let you may know the answer to this because you did some background reading, but offhand, do you know when the Newspaper Preservation Act became law? Because
I read your article, and it's surprisingly early, and I can't remember off the top of my head. I'm gonna say 1970, somewhere around there.
1970. It was let me do the math. 55 years ago that the newspaper industry was so distraught about its competitive abilities that it pressured Congress and the Nixon administration. It was President Nixon who signed it to pass the Newspaper Preservation Act. But what that did was it actually fostered more consolidation in the industry because it gave antitrust protection to proprietors. So instead of that generating more competition, it allowed the largest newspaper proprietors to buy other newspapers without having to suffer consequences. So it's just a brief little exercise in data history to just show what bullshit it is to say that this is an anomaly. The reality is that beginning with the introduction of commercial broadcasting really in the 1920s. And again, there's a public policy element here, which is the 1930 Communications Act, which gave the government the authority to regulate the airwaves, including licensing of broadcasters. Those facts really began this long slog of consolidation. So by the time I get into the industry, as a journalist, beginning in 1978, and you and my younger colleagues kind of followed 10 or 20 or 30 years later, we thought of it as the norm that you would have giant companies like the Walt Disney Company or Rupert Murdoch's News Corporation, or Comcast. We just thought it was normal that you would have these giant multinational conglomerates dominating the scene. That was not the case prior to broadcasting.
Let me ask a question I had not intended to ask you, but it's around the role of when should legislation occur, and who invariably ends up being the winners and losers. And I wasn't familiar with all the history you just laid out, but I looked at Europe and GDPR, and that's now, it's been out for a number of years. But when that was coming, I looked at that and said, that's going to hurt the mid-sized publishers, because you're going to get the biggest companies, the Metas, the Googles, etc., who have the resources to deal with the legislative burden. The mid-sized publishers are going to be hurt. And so I guess one question for you is just generally the role of legislation. Are you then a favor of sort of light touch? Because every time legislators seem to get involved, they have the best of intentions, but the legislation invariably creates second order effects that they haven't thought through. So what can we learn from these sorts of examples?
Well, first of all, I'll disagree with one premise, but just very, very lightly. I don't think they all begin with the best of intentions. I think you can go back to the very, very earliest days of American history and predate, to the earliest days of legislatures and non-royal governments, and you can see that legislation, when it relates to especially microeconomics, is almost always a form of competition within industries, that industry players on one side are always trying to game the system in their favor and against their competition in other areas of the business. But with that, that's a minor quibble, because yes, there obviously are legislators and parties that do have the public interest in mind, and there are almost always second order consequences to these things, as you've pointed out. GDPR, when I was at IAB, I can't tell you the amount of money we spent, the amount of time we spent sending people to Brussels, working to organize our colleagues in the 43 or 45 other IABs around the world, to point out that GDPR, as it was being proposed, ultimately as it was written, was going to grandfather in the advantages of the largest conglomerates and make it extraordinarily difficult for, as you mentioned, SMBs in the publishing industry to compete. It's exactly what happened. There's no surprises here. It has not created any kind of new competition. And the reason is very straightforward. Who were the primary proponents of GDPR? It was the largest German newspaper conglomerates who were trying to keep out competition from larger and more technologically capable American companies. That was the basis of GDPR, and unfortunately, it didn't work out for them, and it was easily foreseeable that it wouldn't work out. It didn't promote competition.
What can we learn from lessons, whether it's Europe from 5 or 10 years ago, the newspaper consortiums from 100 years ago, and apply it to the current time? Because again, everybody says that things are fragmenting, but you also have the strongest platforms, whether it, I said Google, but you've got to throw YouTube in that mix in the creative economy. You've got Twitter, X, you've got Facebook, you've got these very strong platforms, and you've got millions and millions of creators, and it feels at times like there's nothing in between. Where do you see an equilibrium being reached that is similar to now or not?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure if there ever, was, or should be an equilibrium when it comes to viewpoint diversity, which is really, what we're talking about. Now, when I say viewpoint diversity, that's a term of art that's used quite a lot in discussing things like the First Amendment, and so we tend to think of it as relating strictly to news and editorial opinions. But I think it also relates equally to creative points of view, and the way different composers and bands and movie makers go about things. And I think it's it is provable, it is undeniable that there is more viewpoint diversity in the world today than there has ever been before. Period. Full stop. Look at YouTube. YouTube is my favorite example of this, and I'm going to get some of the data wrong. We could probably look it up in real time now, but there are literally hundreds of thousands of YouTube channels that are larger than the largest television networks. Thousands of them, larger than the largest television networks. And when you talk about the total number of channels, when you get down to the smaller and smaller ones, there are millions upon millions of YouTube channels. And they are trafficking in things that you and I, growing up, never, ever had access to. Why didn't we have access to them? Because we were consigned. When I was growing up, you had 3 broadcast television networks in the United States that dominated all opinion making and news distribution. Now, the fact of the matter is that we grew up in a gate-kept media environment that, I'm going to use the word controlled, but I don't mean it in a kind of a political or economic sense. I just mean it in a distribution sense. They controlled what we saw and what we heard, and thus how we thought. And today we have millions and millions of them that we never, ever had access to. I could never watch a Bollywood movie. And that's mainstream. That's mainstream in India. You go further down that list, it's extraordinary what we have access to.
What does this mean for the future role of I don't want to use the word serious journalism or curated, but when you and I think about New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, paid journalists on staff, And that model has been under pressure, continues to be under pressure. Even my former colleagues at Yahoo and Yahoo News, that would have been considered a sort of mid-sized publisher, has challenges around a lot of these pressures. Do you see a path out for those types of, I'm going to say, I don't know whether we're going to categorize them as news agencies or aggregators of news content, but that role, do you think that that's sustainable going forward?
Well, I think you've got a number of interesting issues that intersect, and they're not necessarily all consistent with each other, but they create the complexity that leads to this question. What do we do? And in no particular order. Well, I think starting at the top, I would say we in this industry, especially you, the yield doctor, we tend to think almost in narrow economic terms, that everything is a question of supply and demand. And what I would say when we're talking about news in particular, but also kind of publishing more broadly, which can cover lots of things that aren't news, as we just discussed, there's not an issue here of supply and demand. There's an issue of attention. And so one of the ramifications of living in a gate-kept media environment is you have a degree of reasonable control over people's attention. And the more you fragment that attention by increasing the supply of other things out there, the less you're able to get people to focus on this very important thing over here, or that very important thing over there, or that very important thing over there. So, there's a dilemma here too, which is, and I see very few people in the publishing industry really grappling with this. I'll return to that point in a minute. Is okay, how much do you want to, and this, by the way, what I'm about to say gets into a very, very interesting area relative to public policy, antitrust, and the like, which is, okay, how much competitive ability, how much competition in an economy, in a society, are you willing to sacrifice in order to concentrate attention? And, from the standpoint of, let's say, antitrust law, there you go, well, that's not for us. No, we want more competition. Well, hold on there. I've got, 10 million YouTube channels over here. You're telling me that YouTube is a threat to democracy. Okay. What do you want to do about that? What do you want to do? How much of YouTube do you want to shut down in order to be able to concentrate attention? Oh, by the way, what do you want them to concentrate attention to? Who's going to make those decisions? You want the government to decide, which of course is what Trump is trying to do right now. So I think that these are fascinating issues. Where I have less tolerance for it, I have a lot of tolerance. I just got off of a Zoom. There's a weekly Zoom among New York Times alumni, some of the greatest people I've ever had the honor to work with in my life, and this issue, kind of continues to arise. It's we liked it when everybody paid attention to us, when we had the front page that everybody read, but don't we also like it now that we've got other places that are putting their resources into the things that we didn't actually have the resources to cover? I mean, I give you an example. The blog SCOTUS blog, which is has broken more stories about the Supreme Court than the New York Times ever did, and we had the best Supreme Court reporters on earth. Well, aren't we better off that SCOTUS blog exists? Aren't we better off with Talking Points Memo, which is a terrific political publication that I look at, which does incredible investigative work in politics? Well, they're doing better investigative work than even the largest newspapers were able to do back then, because we now have structures and systems and economics that allow for smaller scale publishing on more and more topics. So, I mean, in a way, I'm not really worried about the supply side because it's being filled all the time by creators, by journalists. I'm not worried about the demand side because obviously there's demand out there, or else those 10 million or so YouTube channels wouldn't exist. I don't know how you reconcile that that supply-demand equilibrium, which I think is out there already, with this problem of concentrating attention on specific issues such that you can create mass action or mass movement when necessary.
So I think you're right in terms of society. We're not going to be short of the right type of supply for content, and demand is certainly not going to be a problem. But staying on sort of the business of being a mid-sized publisher, given that attention continues to get more fragmented, what are the options that people have? One option might be try to aggregate the attention. Another might be try to become more niche and more focused. Off the top of your head, what are the 2 or 3 things that you think that publishers can be doing to react to the current environment?
Well, I'd say you got to start, first of all, with the premise that you don't need conglomerate ownership. You don't need roll-ups in order to create networks. That networks can actually, information networks can and do and have always self-organized. And that if you want to be able to, take advantage either as a soloist publisher or as a publisher that's part of an actual network or a self-organized network, there's nothing better than quality and serving the needs of your audience to be able to attract the attention that you need. I mean, I'll give you another example based on history. You know what the first, you know about the Associated Press, obviously, United Press International, these the news networks, news associations. You know what? When the first one was in the United States? No reason for you to know. It was in the late 1800s. I'm sorry, in the late 1700s, early 1800s. The founders of the United States basically built into the Constitution what I'll refer to as a franking privilege, by which newspapers in any part of the country could mail themselves for free. They wouldn't have to pay postage to mail their newspapers to other newspapers. Why? Well, very deliberately, that they wanted to create this kind of national news network to help news proprietors in distant places fill their pages with news without having to report it directly. But why would the Congress get involved in that? Because they wanted to create, through time, as the United States grew further west, from the east, they wanted to create this national economy. And the best way to create a national economy was to create forms of national attention. And by linking newspapers together in this informal network that was made economically viable because they didn't have to pay postage to each other or to mail to each other, is what did it. So there are ways to do it, but in the end, it wouldn't have worked if newspaper A, that's mailing itself for free from Nebraska, to newspaper B in Massachusetts. Well, unless newspaper A had something to say that was going to be of interest to newspaper B, it wouldn't get picked up. So that's, I think, a lesson that we also continue to learn. I'll throw in something else also from a little bit from left field, but it's very recent. And I know it applies, but we'd have to talk it through. I was fascinated with this year's Academy Awards. Now, partly we were paying special attention because I think my wife was in Anora, that won Best Picture, and so we were paying a lot of attention to that.
Congratulations!
Yeah. But Anora cost $6 million to make. One of the other top nominees, The Brutalist, which is visually stunning. I thought it was kind of empty, but it was visually stunning. Cost $10 million to make. Wicked cost $140 million to make. Now, you know what? $6 million is kind of the equivalent of a low-end YouTube channel, or a low-end blog in the world of movies. And I think we should be celebrating the fact that the tools of production and distribution have grown so inexpensive that it has unleashed this wave of creativity and insight in our world. So we ought to be thinking more about that. And again, what makes it work? Why did Anora get all this attention? Because it's a great movie. That's why.
Yeah. Changing directions a little bit, Randall. You have worked with a ton of different agencies, and over that time, do you have any lessons that would be useful for someone running a branding campaign?
I'll tell you one story. You want a story about that?
Absolutely, that would be fantastic.
So, I very proud of a book I wrote. It was first published in 1991, called "Where the Suckers Moon." It's still in print. The subtitle is "The Life and Death of an Advertising Campaign," and as a lot of people in the industry know, it was the narrative story of Subaru, the car company's search for a new advertising agency and a new brand that would resurrect it to its former glory that it had fallen way off from. And I used that story, the Subaru narrative, to do a cultural history of advertising. But I went deep into the history of Subaru because I was fascinated with the question, where does a brand come from? How does it work? And when we ask the question, how does a brand work? What do we mean by that? What is the meaning of, is it working? And so I followed that everywhere, including the history of Subaru. Now, at the time, the problem that Subaru had run into, it had gone from selling a peak of, I want to say, about 120,000 units a year to a trough of about 85,000 units a year, but that had happened in a very short period of time. And one of the things that they knew just from all their owner research and buyer research is that Subaru was heavily oriented. In fact, it was almost a caricature of Subaru owners that they were all teachers and engineers. And in fact, salespeople who worked at dual or triple dealerships, with multiple brands on them, say they could tell a Subaru buyer walking onto the lot, from 100 yards off, teachers or engineers. And the company wanted to kind of break out of that at all. And so it was something that was really interesting, and I kept, was pursuing it. And I decided to, go back to the origins of Subaru, which are fascinating because it was the offshoot of one of the last Zaibatsu in Japan, and it was actually founded by a guy named Fuji, who was the godfather of the Japanese pro-war movement after World War I. He was the guy who said Japan must build an armed air force, and this is really the early part of the 20th century. And so I'm pursuing this story, and I end up when I'm in Tokyo having a meeting with the top car critic at one of the top Japanese newspapers. It was the Brock Yates of Japan. He was a guy who reviewed cars, and his word was like the word of God. And so through a translator, we're talking quite a lot about the history of Subaru and where it came from and the history of the Fuji Heavy Industries, Zaibatsu, and I said to him, "Tell me who Subaru's customers are." Now, Japan couldn't be more different than the United States, obviously. "Tell me who Subaru's customers are." And he says, "Oh, everybody knows Subaru's customers. They're all teachers and engineers." And that was just like fascinating because here, the US, they're all teachers and engineers. But the US company was an import company. It was a bunch of Jewish salesmen had been founded by a bunch of Jewish salesmen from Philadelphia from the ground up, and they just imported these cars. So how is it that these two different countries with two different marketplaces could end up having the same exact demographics of their buyers? Well, the answer was very straightforwardly, this was my aha moment. your brand is built into your company and your products. Advertising agencies cannot, no matter how arrogant they cannot change your brand for you. Your brand lives inside your product, your company, your culture, your history, and all the relationships among the many constituencies that make up your company. The people on the production line, the engineers who are doing the designs, the colorists who are trying to figure out what color the car should be, obviously your dealers and your salespeople and your distributors. They are your brand, and their collective consciousness is what makes the brand. The only thing that a great ad agency can do, that an average ad agency cannot do, is to take that collective consciousness and realize it in an extraordinarily novel and creative way that will somehow break through to the audience. So I think that's my best lesson about where brands come from.
I love it. And I guess one question about that, was there something that you found about the brand that resonated with the teachers and engineers?
Yes.
What was it?
Well, Subaru, and this is what grew Subaru in the United States. They very, very early in their history here, they lucked into hiring what was then a small agency that grew much larger called Levine, Huntley, Schmidt and Beaver. Later got sold to Gray Advertising, and they kind of I'm going to use a word out of postmodern literary theory. They reified Subaru's brand in one of the most brilliant advertising slogans that I've ever known, ever heard of, and that was inexpensive and built to stay that way. And the idea that it was unusual, it was cheap to own, but it was rugged and durable, put it, in a place where the most intelligent people who are willing to do research about what they should buy will be attracted to it. And so that was it. There was a great story that I learned when I was in Japan, that the Zaibatsu, it was broken apart after the end of World War II, when the U.S. The Allies win the war, they break apart all these military conglomerates, and so here's Subaru, its predecessor, which made the engines. It actually made the engines for the Zero fighters. Those are the kamikaze planes. But what it was famous for, it was known as such a fanatical engineering company that even after it was broken up, they weren't even allowed to make cars. They were only allowed to make motor scooters, not even motorcycles, motor scooters. But those old engineers that had been working on those engines for the Fuji fighters, people were telling me stories about going in, and the engineers would be filing pistons by hand to make sure that they were perfect. That's how fanatical they were about engineering. So that engineering culture was so embedded in the soul of this company that finding a way, and that's why it attracted teachers and engineers, but finding a way to communicate that outside that cohort was the challenge that they needed to rise to.
Brilliant. I love it. Randall, as we come to the end of the time, firstly, thank you so much for taking the time to talk through all these different dynamics. Do you have any closing thoughts for our audience? And what is the best way for people to find you if they have questions or want to continue the conversation?
Well, let's see, what my concluding thought. I would say that, per our earlier conversation, publishing remains a great business. Always has been, and by and large, it won't make you rich. And you know what? It really didn't, unless you were Hearst or Pulitzer. Pretty much didn't make you rich. Could still make you one of the most prominent people in your community. But like when I was growing up, the local newspaper owners, they were prominent because they sponsored little league teams, and that's how they used their money. So I would say that if you want to really have a great career in publishing, You should do it because you're serving a community and you're making enough money to live a decent life, not because you're going to be some, gazillionaire tech oligarch. Don't do it.
It's a good call to action.
Yeah, and if people want to reach me, it's very easy. My website is randallrothenberg.com. One word, with a dot in it, randallrothenberg.com. And I'm Randall at randallrothenberg.com. And I am, open for business. I do real consulting projects, some of which are, they vary. I've done everything from, helping create a thought leadership infrastructure for a measurement company to co-authoring a book with a U.S. senator. So I do a lot of different things, and if anybody is interested, they know where to find me.
Again, thank you so much for taking the time, Randall. It's been an absolute pleasure.
James, a pleasure. I hope to be in more taxis with you in the future.